What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Better You Project, optimizing health, hormones, and aesthetics. And today I am such a fangirl because I have a very special guest on my podcast. I have Dr. Betty Murray. If you are not familiar with Dr. Betty Murray, she has the most amazing podcast where if you are a female and you're worried about your hormones, or if you're a male and you're taking care of female patients, or you're married to one, this would be a wonderful podcast to listen to. She is the CEO and founder of Minerva for Women Living Well in Dallas Functional Medicine Center. She's a researcher, she's an author, she's a speaker. And then I gave her actually a new title in that she debunks a lot of stupid shit on the internet, which is one of my favorite things about Betty. So, Betty, are you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for that amazing intro.
Quick and to the point. Only because I have so many questions that I want to just unwrap and unfold with you. First, let's start off with the important stuff. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this kind of women's health advocacy space.
Yeah, I think almost everybody kind of in the functional medicine space has their own story. So I would say first and foremost, medicine and nutrition was not my original career. I was in sales and marketing immediately out of college, got swept into technology in the early 90s. So the dial-up days, for those of us who are old enough to remember that. And when I was in technology, I was working for a company reporting to the CTO, first woman hired into an all-male department in a very misogynistic environment. And, so I was like anybody else, I'm working twice as long for half as much money. And, under that stress, I started taking like yoga and meditation, all this other stuff. But I'd had a digestive problem that would come and go. And as a typical like 20 something, you kind of like, well, it's maybe the pizza I had the night before or whatever. And it didn't really stick around until I really got under that level of stress. And I ended up being diagnosed with colitis. Mm-hmm. And so when I asked what I thought was a legitimate question, from the gastroenterologist who's starting to run down, here's the drugs you're going to be on for the rest of your life. I just asked, could I change my diet and change the trajectory of this disease? And he barked this laugh in my face and said it had nothing to do with food. Well, you can probably already tell from my personality, I had some choice words to say about how stupid that was. And I was just like, cool, I'm going to go take some health and nutrition classes and figure this out on my own. So I started a certified nutritionist program and also a master's at the same time. And, that's when it clicked. I was like, oh my God, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Because I'd been into bodybuilding and I read about nutrition in my free time. So I go out, do that, go through school, start working on my diet and everything else. And lo and behold, my colitis gets better. So I go out and do what everybody does. I'm going to hang a shingle. I'm going to start my clinic. So I start my clinic. I create Living Well Dallas with a friend. We're the first integrative functional medicine-based clinic in Dallas with multi-specialty. I, of course, don't realize there's no tribe and you need a lot more money in 2006. But so we started that. But, a couple years later, I get into my late 30s. I'd had a tubal because I didn't want to be on birth control. So I'm sure you talk about that a lot with your audience because it's like, oh, do I want to be on that? And not very long after that, and of course, hindsight's where a lot of this came in, all of a sudden, my hair starts falling out. I get acne across the lower part of my chin. I'm gaining weight around the abdomen, doing the exact same stuff I had done before.
Right.
And, crime scene period, all this stuff. And, I have access to functional medicine people, and they're like, oh, we think it's your thyroid from being a bodybuilder. So I'm on thyroid. And then they're like, no, you need testosterone. Oh, no, you need this. No, you need that. And I go through my 40s and it's awful. I mean, awful. I'm overweight. I feel terrible. I just want menopause to come. And I finally got to about 48 and I'm like, I am having such a horrible time. If I'm having this much of a horrible time and I know other women are because I see them every day, there's something more. So I went back to get my Ph.D. So I got another master's and a Ph.D. in the process, and really studied hormone metabolism and that interaction with the gut and all the pieces that nobody talks about. And so at the end of the day, I had to really figure out my own stuff. So I feel better today at 55 than I did at 40, being 7 years postmenopausal. And, so this is kind of the hill I'm going to die on, because the other part that was really important to me, and it's why I started this entire practice to begin with, is I was already sick with something that affects 50 million people. 9 out of 10 people with autoimmune conditions are women. 3 out of 4 people with IBS are women. Most of the diseases that are chronic and debilitating are women mostly. And it's just, we are in a travesty of a war on women's health and women's research. And it's going to get worse rather than better. And so this is now my hill.
Yeah, absolutely. This is exactly why I wanted you on the podcast, because you are one of the leading, I would say, experts in functional medicine when it comes to hormone metabolites, metabolism. And not only that, like I slid in one of your DMs one day and I'm like, the fucking title of this article is horrible. They're blaming progesterone for what progestins did. And you're like, sis, I know. Yeah.
It's so frustrating.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It is so frustrating. And I all day, patients, and we're trying to educate, and it's like, you can do all the amazing things. It's like one shitty TikTok or one shitty article comes out and it's like the whole last 3 years of me teaching you, my patient, about this hormones. And now you're like questioning it again. I'm like, again, we're back here. You know what I mean? But that's why we're here, right? That's why we're here. You and I, we put out content like this, education, because we want women to feel safe in having choices and making sure we have a very good, informed patient, because they, you only get one body to live in. And so we want to give them all the options. So for today's episode, what I wanted to do is I wanted to dig in with you specifically. Why do hormones get such a bad rap in medicine? I feel like this is such a big topic, so it needs a big knowledge, a big brain like you to help me unbox it and get into some of the details. Are you ready? I know you're ready.
Yeah, I'm totally.
You could do this in your sleep. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's start in Women's Health Initiative, 2002. Why was this a turning point for hormone therapy when it comes to women's health and like the right to choose what your hormone, if you even get a hormone option? Right. What was the study and why was it a problem?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to back up a little bit to give some context. So first and foremost, up until 1900, the average lifespan of a woman was under 57 years. So if you went through menopause at 51, did anybody give a crap, including you? Because your life expectancy was just a couple years, if you were lucky, right? If you were lucky. So living 30 to 40 years post-menopausal is a new adventure for our human body. Now, we flash forward 100,000 years. Maybe we go to menopause at 75. I don't know. But this is new for us. So yes, menopause is natural. Living a long time after it is not. And so, so that's first and foremost. Number two, hormone replacement in the form of, at one point, there was topicals and actually pellet therapy has been around for a long time. And then Premarin was standard of care in most Western countries from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? And at one point, Premarin was prescribed at a greater level than statin drugs. So we have to remember that, like, my mom's generation were put on hormone replacement, just kind of like, oh, you're 50, here you go, right? So then we get to the Women's Health Initiative, which, they had a just and reasonable reason for looking at this. So what they wanted to identify was if hormones, and I'll clarify which ones, could protect against stroke and heart attack, particularly mortality, dying. And so they had 3 arms to the study: a group that did nothing, a group that they put on Premarin only, and which is an oral estrogen, and then a group they put on Premarin and a synthetic medroxyprogesterone called progestins. And the biggest thing about the study, and you have to understand how to read a study and look at deeper in the data, because usually the abstract is bullshit, and especially in the journal, because they're going to spin it because they got advertisers. So the important part of the study is they're trying to figure out potential for death. Well, this study can't run for 30 years because that'd be $1 billion. So what they did is they picked a group of women that were much older. So the average age was almost 62 years old. They already had cardiovascular disease. So 3/4 of them were overweight or obese. They had metabolic syndrome, hypertension, high cholesterol, and many, if not a significant portion of them, either were smokers or were still smokers, all of which escalate your risk for cardiovascular event, regardless of what you're doing. Right. And the reason why they did that is they wanted to see who dies. Now, they didn't have a control group that were also healthy, which is highly important because you have nobody to compare to. Right. So they start the study, and a couple years in, they notice that the group that is on the Prem-Pro combo have a slightly increased risk of stroke. And they stopped the study, right? I would say appropriately so. There's no reason to continue a particular arm of the study if you know the treatment you're giving is already damaging. So while they're going through and compiling their data and getting information, number one, a subset of that group had gone into the study. So the researchers themselves, and I won't get the exact quote together, but they had the belief that they needed to stop the runaway train of women getting hormone replacement, right? And so they started digging through the data. And one of the stats that they found was a slight change in breast cancer risk. So let me give that data because it is extremely important because it still gets misrepresented. So every woman over 50 has a 4 in 1,000 chance for breast cancer. Now, when you get to 80, it gets to 1 in 8. And people go, why? I'm like, because your DNA starts having spelling errors, right? It's because we just, things slow down. We're not as good at it. So all women have a 4 in 1,000 chance in menopause. In this study, in that same Prem-Pro arm, they had a 5 in 1,000 increased risk, right? So 5 out of 1,000 women, 4 out of 1,000 women, completely meaningless data, completely meaningless. However, you and I both know, and especially as a statistician, I can make something look sensational just by how I write it in research. So going from a 4 to a 5 was a 25% increase in that number population, but it wasn't statistically significant. But that statement was left off, and most people don't know what that means. That means it's not even worth writing about. And they released that data to the press before peer review. Peer review is really important because that's where non-biased individuals are going through your stuff and make sure it's accurate, right? But by the time they even go through peer review, it has hit the media and it was like wildfire. So overnight, millions of women worldwide were taken off of hormones, terrified that they were going to die. And doctors were given a black box warning around estrogen in particular. And it wasn't even estrogen doing it. It's the synthetic medroxyprogesterone, synthetic progestins, TIN. And those we know cause clotting risk. We know that does that in young girls. That's why we have class action lawsuits on birth control that are progestins only. And so the only risk that was ever seen were the people in that progestin group. Now, what's even more interesting is the group in that initial study that were on Premarin alone had a 23% reduced risk of breast cancer compared to the group that did nothing. And yet to this day, that still doesn't get press for it. And so women have been inappropriately terrorized, and really the boomers have been robbed of their health because now doctors are like, no, you can't have that. They gatekeep it like it's some sort of crack, And the reality is replacing hormones with bioidentical forms at a biological, physiological level protects your brain, your heart, your bones. Full stop.
Yeah, perfectly put. I feel like when I discuss this with patients, I try to keep it, straight to the point. Wrong population. These people were unfortunately unhealthy and a little bit out of the window that I like to see. Okay. The route of administration was not the route that I typically do, in our practice. And it was the wrong type of progesterone. I like to use micronized bioidentical progesterone. Or I like to use a patch for estrogen, or a cream, or an insert, or a pellet, something, not oral, but something. So again, there's so many what went wrongs that never got publicized that, many of my patients, and I'm sure you've read the book, Estrogen Matters, right? I tell patients, you need to read this book, because Dr. Blooming does such a great job of breaking down where the problems in that study happened. Out of curiosity, I know you know this research so well. Do you know why that the statisticians didn't get to review it? Like what was the debacle as to why that didn't happen?
They actually reviewed it, but it was post exposure.
It was after the fact. Yeah.
After the fact. So it was just that they intentionally, that subgroup intentionally released content before it was completed. Yeah. And what's interesting is, they had an 8-year follow-up, 18-year follow-up, and then they recalculated their stats as of this year, and all of their assertions fell out. Right. But again, not even a whisper in the media, right?
Nobody
not even a
knows
whisper in the media. And so I have a lot of people ask me, they're like, Betty, why is that? And I'm like, the reality is women in medicine are perceived as bikini. We are breasts and ovaries and uterus. And once you are past that, you are dried up, unnecessary, whiny woman, and they don't care, right? That's the reality.
Yeah.
And it's the only hormone deficiency that we treat like that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. It's ridiculous. Like it's almost sad that it's like the more research I learn, the more I'm like, why, and and this is what I tell patients too, because, we have, so I live in the Midwest, which is not the most progressive area, but, I have GYNs who are like, yes, do the hormones, like let them optimize your hormones, get on the estrogen patch or, whatever. And then like, literally the GYN in the same practice will be like, oh my God, that is terrible. Do not do that. So I tell the patient, I go, listen, my job here is to educate you and give you all the education, make your own informed decision, right? I'm not gatekeeping nothing. I said, but honestly, if it were that black and white and clear as day, why do you have two doctors in the same practice who can't agree? You know what I mean? Like if it was that cut and dry, it would be like, everybody knows this answer, but it's not, right? So there's got to be a little bit truth to, which we know there's a lot of truth to the research that hormones are very safe, again, in the right context, right patient, right dose, right route, right population, all those things. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, can you differentiate for me progestins versus progesterone? Yes. Because I feel like when we see we see titles of articles and it's like, okay, what was actually used? Because you're saying progesterone, and if I go in here and I see medroxyprogesterone, I'm like, that's not the right one,
Yeah. So this is all about research clarity and appropriate language. So let's talk about what a hormone is. The difference between bioidentical and not bioidentical. So a bioidentical hormone is exactly chemically like the hormone that you make. So think of your hormone as a key. Right. So my estrogen key or my progesterone key is going to click into the lock on the cell and turn the lock and turn on whatever action it needs to turn on. When it's bioidentical, it's the same as if you took that key to Lowe's and had them make a bunch of copies. It works perfectly. Mm-hmm. Now, when it's synthetic, the key kind of looks like it, but maybe it's a little different and it doesn't really work perfectly. You have to jiggle the lock and you might be able to get it to move, but it's not the same. So medroxyprogesterone is synthetic. Now, why would we have that? Synthetic drugs can be patented. Bioidentical things that can be found in nature chemically cannot be patented. So your drug companies make no money on it because as soon as they come out with it, everybody can make it. Mm-hmm. And so they have very low interest in doing that. Medroxyprogesterone, the synthetic form, is a progestin. The problem in the research is researchers will flip back and forth between progesterone, which is what your body makes, and or bioidentical, and progestins in the same context when they are absolutely 100% different. Mm-hmm. And synthetic progestins cause clotting risk, among many other things. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the other risks, kind of seen more in line with the progestins is, we think about taking it orally, goes through the gut, goes through first pass, goes through that hepatobiliary system. And so I tell patients, like there's honestly more risk when you're taking oral contraceptive pills than there are with these little hormones they give you, and and it kills me because you got GYNs who, throw women almost like recklessly on oral contraceptive pills. And then you give them a little whiff of some Climera and they're like lost their damn mind. You know what I mean? Like
totally
drives me crazy. It drives me bonkers. So besides, we talked about rise of liver enzymes is one of the most common things I see. Increased 100%. Risk of clotting factors. That's another one. Increased risk of high sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker. Increase in LDL and triglycerides, again, because that hepato clearance is not clearing. Changes in thyroid hormone because of the rise of sex hormone binding globulin. So it's more than just this like one little thing. There's these things that in functional medicine, we call downstream effects. And literally it's everything. It just screws up everything. And so I think it's very important, again, just as I'm trying to do a very good informed consent when I'm putting women on hormones, I feel like the GYNs also need to give us that same respect in that, have you really consented your patient on all the things that can go wrong with this birth control? Not that I think birth control is not needed in some maybe short-term cases, but I think there's so many great options now that it doesn't have to be that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it is. It's true. And I had an entire podcast. It was the 5 questions your doctor should be able to answer and also ask. And one of them, what is informed consent, right?
That's
that
good.
informed consent is not only what does this drug do, it's what this drug can do that's bad. It's what are the many, many, many other options, even if I don't offer them in my office all of that, like that, there's a huge problem with that. And you're right. We throw young girls, little girls on very high dose birth control. And they're like, I live in Texas. And so bodily autonomy is highly in question in Texas. And I can understand the concern about having that control. And we don't have a bioidentical natural birth control, right? But the reality is the drugs in those are all synthetic and much, much higher in dose. When you're doing bioidentical hormone replacement to get to physiological level in menopause and premenopause, you're looking at about 10% of the estrogen that you actually made at ovulation every damn month. We're talking minuscule amounts to get physiological. And I think that's the message that also doesn't get out there, because doctors will go, oh, they're giving you huge amounts. I'm like, 10% of what you made? Like that's what we're trying to hit, is about 10% of what your body made at ovulation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's also really interesting too. I presented at this longevity conference on testosterone in women and why it's important. Right. And so I took one of my own patients, labs, obviously took PHI out of it. And I showed 25-year-old female, this is what her testosterone was. And this is what her estradiol was. When you actually zeroed them out to be the same unit of measure, she had more testosterone than she did estrogen.
100%.
I'm like, this is, nanograms per deciliter versus nanograms per picoliter, zero them out. She's got more T than E, and it blows people's mind, because we always think, estrogen or progesterone, testosterone, that I feel like always gets, it's pushed to the back seat kind of thing. So that's very, very important, I think, as you're looking at these numbers. Are we talking about apples and apples or apples and oranges kind of thing? So
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing that we see misconception wise in the estrogen world is you have to wait to start the estrogen until you've been, this is such a arbitrary number, 1 year without one period, and it's like, no, you don't have to wait till you're dried up and shriveled. Let's get a little estrogen on board sooner than later. Can you talk a little bit why this is such a big misconception?
Yeah, no, it is. And I would say my own experience was that, right? Because we had, even in the functional medicine community, there's the idea of estrogen dominance, and many, many women enter in, and at some point in their 40s, often are in an estrogen dominant state. So the reality is, when you look at these hormones, progesterone is on a steady decline. Testosterone's on a steady decline after 20, right? And we need both of those. But the reality is estrogen is variable. And in the beginning, it is somewhat variable, but also often trackable, because that's the other argument. Gynecologists in particular go, oh, they're too variable, we can't test for it. I'm like, because you can't read a app that tracks your period. Come on. Right. But the reality is we start to get high variability. So when we're in our 40s, our estrogen becomes high relative to progesterone. Right. It may in itself not be high, but it's the disparity between the two. And so a lot of times you start to see some of those side effects. You might get sleep issues, you might get insulin resistance and weight gain around the middle and all those things, hair loss, all these other little things. But as you start moving further down that menopause timeline, you get what I call the ketchup bottle effect. So when a ketchup bottle is full, you squeeze it out on your fully organic, all beef hot dog, right? And it's perfect, the perfect S. But when you get into the later part of your 40s, in many cases, sometimes it's earlier, sometimes it's later, it's the ketchup bottle is empty. So you shake it and you get a little bit, and then it splats, right? So it is highly variable. So where I think people miss it, particularly functional medicine people, is they'll go, oh, you're estrogen dominant because you're exhibiting it, right? You're exhibiting it, and they'll go, oh, no, you can't. You can't, because you're just going to have more estrogen. Right. But the reality is you probably also have more estrogen receptors than somebody who maybe was more on an androgenic sort of phenotype. And the reality is the variability behind there would probably calm down with a little bit of estrogen. So a lot of people withhold estradiol or even a biased replacement because this person has been estrogen dominant. But we would actually see a better balancing with some low dose estrogen as you enter that timeline, because bone loss accelerates in the last few years of perimenopause, not after menopause, right? And so that shows that the overall effect of estrogen is declining rapidly. rapidly. And so I think that was I know for sure that was part of mine, because I had been so estrogen dominant, to be honest. You can tell, like, if you have a badonkadonk butt and you're highly curvy, you have estrogen, right? And and I've always been that way. And so, I think doctors are missing the point of, we need to look at it. We might need to trend value it over the course of an entire month and see where we're at. And we might need to replace it before they hit that, really variable periods or no period at all.
Right. I'll be really curious to see, and I'm hoping to God someone studying this is, GLP-1s have been such a big craze, for a lot of reasons, right? But one of the most common side effects slows down gastric motility. So the risk of constipation tends to be a little bit of an issue. Well, when we have those perimenopausal, menopausal patients, I feel like they struggle with constipation anyway, right? Yep. You know this, I know this. I wonder if we will see like a rise in that beta glucuronidase marker when these women, they're trying to detox their own estrogen. Unfortunately, their liver's not doing a great job because they're using maybe wine to wind down, and then they can't poop because they're on GLP-1s or tirzepatide or something. So it'll be really interesting, in the next 15, 20 years to see the data that comes out of and there was a new study that just came out saying starting your hormones at the same time as starting your GLP-1s can actually yield a much more significant body composition result. Listen, it's on like my TiVo for the weekend. I'm going to get through that study this weekend. But but it's amazing. It's amazing to see kind of like what can happen when if you help people control their insulin, all the other things kind of work a lot better. Oh,
absolutely. And so I think there's several things there. So I don't know if you know that, but that was actually my dissertation, was looking at women living without IBS.
I did know that.
Yeah,
yes.
And cycling women. So I can tell you what the data is because it's published. So the data showed, so we were looking retrospectively. So there's a lot of things that could be troubling with that data, right? Was it, we're using EMR records. So was it really mixed, or was it constipation, or was it diarrhea dominant? We don't know where they were in their cycle the day that they did their stool test and all of that. But what we found in a relatively moderate sized population of about 440 records that we knocked down to about 220, I'll say I knocked down to about 220 and looked at, is beta glucuronidase levels were higher in mixed and constipation dominant diarrhea. One of the things that we know is beta glucuronidase climbs as you go through menopause. The entire microbiome changes, and some of that is because it is changing to allow for greater hepatic circulation of the estrogen-like compounds to try and accommodate what's no longer being made. And so, the other really important thing is we have receptors for all of those hormones in the gut. They go through the same progesterone, testosterone, even serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. They all go through the same liver detox pathways. They all have the same glucuronidation pathway. And we have a lot of untapped understanding of that interaction between the gut and those hormones. The other part of that GLP study is when we have estrogen on board, and I would argue testosterone balanced as well, and progesterone to some degree, we have a metabolic effect of reduced inflammation, reduced visceral fat, because estrogen affects that. It also affects mitochondrial function and glucose utilization at GLUT4, which is the transport into the mitochondria. So when you add a GLP on top of that, you're getting this huge compounding effect that a perimenopause to menopausal woman wouldn't have without the hormones, because they're missing a hormone that affects every single cell in the body except for two.
I know, that's amazing. It's amazing. So I got to read that study. But yes, I did know that about you, because I was like, look, I like her even more. Yeah. That's good. Let me ask you this, because I feel like this is a common question that we get. And I feel like our sweet spot in my practice, our patient population is kind of like 45 to about 55, which is the perfect window, right?
Right.
What are your thoughts, or kind of like the way clinically you would maybe approach something is like, let's say this lady comes in, she's 70, she went through menopause, average age, 51, 52. And so she's been without hormones for almost like 2 decades now. Like, what are your thoughts on like replacing that estrogen? And I because I feel like this is such a controversial topic, and there's not a right answer. So if you're a patient and you're like, oh my God, my mom said, this is not a controversial topic. Betty is brilliant. And so I want to hear what she has to say about it.
Yeah. So I'd say I'm going to give some of the science too. So In our practice, we've been replacing hormones with bioidentical hormones for 20 years in the clinic and then online with Minerva with my telemedicine company. We have women in their 80s that have been on hormones, and many of those we put on hormones in their mid 60s, right? And so every woman deserves to have that conversation and to be looked at individually because we have the capacity to do an N of one. We are not all the same. So we have the capacity to look at each person individually. Now, where does the data really lie? So especially with oral estrogen and oral progestins, synthetic progestins, because they carry additional clotting risk, if we were 50 years back and that was the choice of treatment, yes, in a much older woman who has more advanced cardiovascular disease, because we all accelerate that after menopause. We're protected until menopause. And in about 5 years, we start to age match men. That's how rapid the loss of estrogen causes inflammatory vascular disease. So in somebody who might be 70, an oral synthetic progestin and a Premarin would be damaging and dangerous. Now, what about bioidenticals? So what's really interesting is there was a study, and I don't know if you saw this, it was put out in the Menopause Journal, and it was 10 million women, right? So they looked at 10 million women, and these were all women over 65. And they looked at retrospective data. So from 2006 to 2023, all-cause mortality. And this was the first study that had a group that had no hormones, another group that had hormones for a little while to get rid of their hot flashes, and then the women that were like, forget it, I'm just going on it and staying on it. And what was very interesting, number one, is in every cause of death, the women that were on hormones and stayed on them had less risk. And breast cancer was like, I can't remember if it was 13 or 16%, but colon cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, all in the teens, reduced risk. Dementia was reduced by 32%. I need people to hear that.
Yeah.
Cardiovascular disease, heart disease, all those other things, osteoporosis, extraordinary changes. And it was the first study that actually had a large arm that was on bioidentical topical estrogen and bioidentical micronized progesterone, right? So what was really cool about that is they showed for the first time that there was zero clotting risk in that group. It was so important that it made it into the abstract. For a statement to make it into an abstract, you only have 350 words there. That is meaningful. So what that means is all the things that we were worried about, aortic stenosis and potential stroke or heart attack risk because of advanced atherosclerotic activity is really mitigated by the use of topical estrogen and oral progesterone that's micronized. And so in these older populations, all right, the risk is now kind of gone. So the next question becomes, what's the likelihood of massive improvement? The window of opportunity probably for the greatest impact on the brain, because it's Mosconi's group out of the Weill Center that probably has the best data about this, is that if we initiate closer to the menopausal time period, what we see is there's less remodeling of the brain. And so we have a great brain effect if we started earlier, but that doesn't mean that adding it later wouldn't protect the brain, the heart, the bones. The brain in particular shrinks when we go through menopause, and then the neural pathways that go to especially the executive centers in the front of the brain pop loose like you're remodeling, those streets, and go to your more creative centers, right? That's why we start to have memory issues and brain fatigue and things like that. But by the time we're about 70, most of that remodeling is done. And so what we believe is that if you start hormone replacement after that, we won't necessarily see a lot of brain remodeling. However, estrogen, particularly in the brain, helps mitochondrial function in the brain, which is radically important. So I would argue that, I think women should have the right to do it, and I think they should go on it. And especially if they feel better, and then we need to test not only their labs, but we need to test their hormone metabolism, which we do in everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. No, that was perfect. Out of curiosity, in your practice, do you check many women, or is it like part of your kind of check-in for like ApoE4?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So, I it's almost like when they get any of the alleles of the 4, it's like, okay, I like have to be able to like articulate and console them kind of thing. And what did I say is one of the best things you're doing to help you are these hormones. Like you're already doing the right stuff, And so I think that's really important to know, and that, they look at a 4 as almost like a death sentence. And I'm like, heck no. It just tells me how much more aggressive do I need to be? We need to make sure we've got good insulin regulation, good insulin control, preserving your muscle, optimize your hormones, keeping inflammation down. And I like to use a lot of methylene blue. We do a lot of methylene blue in our practice to increase BDNF. And like it just helps like cognitively, it helps kind of support dopamine, serotonin. It supports mitochondria. So people get a nice little energy boost from it. It's antimicrobial. So a lot of the postmenopausal patients who tend to get UTIs pretty easily. So, and it's cheap. So and we do lots of peptides. We're big peptide practice. Well, I'm like, let's not forget methylene blue, but it's not a peptide. It's not a peptide. It's
right. No, you're right. And I'm sure you probably talked about the studies, so UTI is one of the greatest risks for sepsis and dying from infection. And so taking hormone replacement therapy, even just a vaginal estrogen, can reduce that risk by 87%. Like every woman in an assisted living center should be on some level of estrogen because that's often what kills them.
Yeah. Isn't it crazy how many people don't know this? Like it blows my mind. Blows my mind.
Oh, yeah, I know. It's mind-boggling.
All right. So let's see here. Next question. Is there anybody that you would say is not a candidate for hormone replacement therapy?
I would say really no. Now, particularly now that we have the data from the 10 million women study, because before it was like, oh, if you're a factor V Leiden, you carry clotting risks, particularly genetic clotting risks, they may not be a candidate. What I would say is that I think that the women that might have additional clotting risks and or really complex liver problems, right, whether they're liver problems because of lifestyle or other problems, or they're on a lot of medications, because the reality is these hormones go through metabolic pathways that drug goes through, that toxins go through, and depending on genetics, we're either good at it or not. In those people that might be like very complex health problems and a lot of medications, I think they just need more management, right? So we need to deeper dive and we need to monitor more. But again, we're looking at relatively low doses to see a metabolic and physiological effect. So to me, the hormones are not probably driving anything radical there. And the goal would be to fix some of the other problems and get the meds and other things that might lead to like liver toxicity out.
Right. No, absolutely. So I feel like we've touched on estrogen. We've touched a little bit on the progesterone. Let's talk a little bit about testosterone. Why is this so important in the perimenopause, menopause sector? And symptom wise, like what are some of the things that women don't realize that's connected to testosterone?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is the topic you brought up. Everybody thinks testosterone is this very minuscule hormone in women because of how we report it on our labs. But at any given time, we are making more testosterone than we ever do estrogen as a woman, right? And the other major drawback is the FDA has only approved testosterone for sexual dysphoric disorder, meaning you're not interested in sex. Whatever. So it's very hard. That's why we don't have a lot of availability in like traditional kind of over the counter, but traditional pharmaceutical preparations. So the reality is testosterone is really important, but it's on a steady decline all the way from our 20s. Like we peak around 2025, and then it's on a steady decline. So by the time you're in your 40s, you're at a minuscule amount compared to where you were, and it has a full metabolic effect across the body. Muscle, right? Being able to put on muscle, keep muscle, it's very important, but it's also extremely active in the brain. So it is part of the interest and motivation and activity in the brain. That's why it's a brain hormone for sexual interest. We are interested in sex between our ears, not our genitals. Right? That's super important. Yes, testosterone and other things and doing stimulation to the genital area can help with sensitivity and orgasm. But the reality is interest lies between the brain. So it's also really important to dopamine signaling and dopamine activity. It has a role even in bone mineral density, and just it's a full body hormone, just like estrogen, and we need it just like men do.
Yes, perfect. I love it. Connect with me, testosterone's protection against breast cancer.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So that's actually really, really cool. So even in triple negative breast cancer, breast cancer. So the first thing we have to get out in the open is breast tissue. And again, every single cell in your body, except for 2, have receptors for estrogen, right? So there's nothing really magical and weird about you having estrogen receptors on breast tissue and progesterone and testosterone receptors. So when a breast cancer gets diagnosed, it's going to get broken into different categories. So it's either going to be ER positive, so estrogen receptor positive, progesterone receptor positive, and then there's also a HER2, HER2. And Then you've got triple negative, which means it doesn't have any of those.
Right.
And the reality is this triple negative is the most aggressive of those cancers, right? Caught early, it's very, very easy to take care of. But if it's been running a little wild for a while,
Right.
it has a high mortality rate. When you have an estrogen or progesterone receptor or even a HER2 receptor positive breast cancer, it's often slow growing and it's often still functioning somewhat as a normal breast tissue. Triple negative, it's not. But what's interesting is testosterone is protective in all of those forms, right? So could it be the loss of testosterone is also causing this greater increase? Because the reality is breast cancer diagnosis on average is 62 in the United States, long after our ovaries have taken a nosedive. So it's not our estrogen. That defies logic. And our testosterone at that point is cratered. I mean, you know this from testing. I know this from testing. You're lucky if it's even readable.
Right.
At 50 something, right? And so we go, okay, so we have no receptors to protect like testosterone. We don't have estradiol circulating to click in. What do you think is hitting that receptor? Every herbicide, pesticide, phthalate, plasticizer, BPA, all that crap that's in our environment that is an estrogen-like compound, it is now on free roam in the body. And I believe that's my working hypothesis is why we see an extraordinary increase in breast cancer when we haven't been doing hormones. It's not that we're better at looking at it and finding it. We actually have more. And it's also why we see it in younger people because we have so much toxicity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love talking to patients about the research by Dr. Rebecca Glazier and the studies she has done with using testosterone and anastrozole and kind of reducing the recurrence rate. And I mean, it's just amazing only because it's kind of like once you've had that breast cancer diagnosis, you're like, oh my God, this is the end. And it's like, hell no, this is not the end. Like, in fact, research shows quite the opposite. Like,
totally.
we can protect you way better with hormones.
Totally. Well, and even the data, like that's why Estrogen Matters as a book should be required reading. Sorry, ladies, even if you don't like science books, get it on Audible and drive around.
Yeah.
You know, because the reality is, even in studies looking at breast cancer, the introduction of estrogen often is protective. Not in all cancers, however, it often is. And testosterone absolutely is. And the idea that a woman can't do hormone replacement later on post breast cancer is also faulty. Right? We have a lot of women that are post breast cancer that are on hormones totally fine.
Yeah. I have found this really great local breast oncologist who a lot of times I require, because I'm a nurse practitioner, I want to make sure I involve other specialties, is I get a written clearance from them to say, nope, they are deemed, they've got symptoms, benefits versus risk, informed consent, here we go. So I have to have that piece of paper. But I found one and I sent her all the research I had by Dr. Rebecca Glazier. And, again, like I'm monitoring it, like all these good things. And so we've been very lucky to be able to help so many patients on that front.
Are you familiar with Dr. Jen Simmons?
Yes.
She's a good friend of mine, and we have a lot of conversations about that. Because here's the thing that people don't realize: tamoxifen is a synthetic estrogen that hits the estrogen receptor B heavily, right? That and estrogen receptor B is cancer protective, right? So that, like, when people hear that, they're like, "What?" I'm like, "Yeah, like we positioned the chemotherapy world to go after those receptors." Like they looked at it and they go, "Oh, there's a receptor on there. We can use that receptor as treatment," but that doesn't necessarily mean that receptor is causing.
Yeah.
Right. And that gets lost in the data.
Yes. I heard, maybe you know more about this. I heard Dr. Simmons is doing some research on maybe kind of finding new ways instead of doing a mammogram, ways that are safer.
Yeah. So Dr. Simmons and Dr. Yvonne Carney and Christine Burke. So Christine Burke's in the Bay Area. Carney is in the Chicago area. And then Jen is up on the Eastern Seaboard. And the reality is there's QT imaging. So QT imaging uses a sonogram-like technology with AI, and it has the definition of an MRI without compression and without radiation.
Yes.
And so you can get it today in those areas. I'm trying really hard to get Yvonne to do a joint venture with me and bring it to Texas because I'm currently building the telemedicine thing. So I don't have $1 million to drop on it. But to be able to do breast screening without adding additional radiation is enormous because we are promoting, I think, excessive use of mammograms where we're actually causing cellular damage.
Yeah, I agree. And it's such a difficult world, again, because we practice functional medicine, integrative medicine, but we will be held to the standard of care, right? So God forbid something happen, I got to make sure I've covered that too. And so I feel like, you know this, we're so torn.
Yeah. Yeah, we're so
I know
torn. Yeah.
another question, I know it wasn't on my list, but I want to know what you think. Cycling progesterone after menopause. I feel like, again, there's so many
No.
schools of thought. I don't, only because I'm like, I don't want to get a call about
like, okay, 10 to 14
bleeding.
days.
Yeah, I'm like, I'm bleeding. I'm like, what the hell? Nobody wants that after menopause. So I
God,
don't.
no.
But
There's no data to support that. There's no data to support cycling.
Listen, love that you said that. Okay.
Oh God, no, because let's look at it. So what's the four most common symptoms women have that they complain about? There was a study that just came out. Fatigue, anxiety,
Insomnia,
right? Depression, brain fog, right?
Yeah.
Why would I take one of the most powerful hormones that help with insomnia and then cycle it just so somebody could have a period? Like, that's the one thing to look forward to at this time of life. Like, get rid of that.
Yes.
No, we don't do it. We don't do it. Even in the perimenopausal woman, if sleep is a primary concern, we keep it. You know, and in women get a breakthrough. Like, if they're like, hey, breakthrough bleeding, I'm like, how many pills did you forget? They're like, oh, I forgot my progesterone. I'm like, yeah, it's going to happen. Because there's always, I think they need to know that there's always a little blood supply in the uterus. So if those hormones aren't balanced, you'll know.
Yeah. You know, I'm so glad to hear you say that. There's someone also I listened to on her podcast. I love her content. And then she said that. I was like, I'm sorry, come again. What? You do what with your patients? Postmenopausally. So yeah, we don't do it only because
that's based on, a lot of that's based on the Wiley protocol.
The Wiley protocol. Yeah.
And yeah, that is how we naturally evolved and to do that. But again, we naturally died around menopause. So we don't necessarily have to mimic nature at 75.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, true. Well, wrapping up here, if you had one thing you wish every patient what needed to know to not be afraid of hormones, like what would be that one or two things?
Yeah, I think number one, go look for that study, just the safety of menopause over 65, right? Like 10 million women, that pretty much puts the nail in the coffin in that story. But I would say the most important thing is that you have a partner that is working with you, that is your partner. They're not a dictator. Sorry, people, this is a customer service industry. Medicine is there to help you, not tell you, right? And if you have somebody like that, freaking fire them immediately. And you deserve to be able to have tests and other things to help you understand what your body is doing with those hormones so you can feel comfortable. Because I think there's also a psychosomatic part of this where if I'm nervous and my doctor really isn't partnering with me, I'm always looking for the shoe to drop, right? And so we need to be able to provide that level of one-on-one data so women can feel comfortable with the choices that they're making. But hormones do not kill us. Otherwise, every 20-year-old would be dying.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Or pregnant people when your hormones are at its highest.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Betty, thank you so much for taking the time. This is like, I mean, I feel it was like one nugget drop after another nugget drop. So this is so great. I so appreciate you taking the time again. I've been a big fan of yours for a very long time, and you just keep doing what you're doing because you're inspiring practitioners like myself to literally question everything and dig into the research and really understand what it's trying to tell you. So, Betty, where can people find you if they want to learn more from you or listen to your podcast? Any conferences that you're going to be speaking at?
Let's see. I just was at South by Southwest speaking about women changing social impact. So you can find me on my podcast at Menopause Mastery. And so any podcast platform, and I put out stuff pretty much weekly. There's always a weekly, but then I put out little shorts and obviously on YouTube as well. You can also find me at bettymurray.com. And then if you happen to be in North Texas, my clinic is Living Well Dallas. And then if you're looking for telemedicine across the United States, you can go to Get Minerva, GETMENRVA. And the reason why, because people are like, that's hard to spell. The reason why we have her is she's the goddess of medicine, science, and war. And it's the Etruscan spelling.
There you go. That's perfect. I will make sure I tag all those good things in the show notes. So this way, listeners, practitioners, patients, if you want to, you got to listen to Betty's stuff. I mean, I feel like she has like almost like mentored me from afar and didn't even know it, you know? So that's really, really good. So again.
I'm lucky because I don't personally prescribe. And I always say that, like, I don't personally prescribe. So
Right.
all I'm here to do is help you understand it so you can make an informed decision. And it really does put me in a very comfortable place because I never have to worry about my bias because I'm not making that decision,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And so-
Absolutely. Again, thank you so much. And I hope all the patients and practitioners really enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed getting to interview you. So thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me.